This is the Media Police Post, broadcasting from the Fort Hall School of Government. In this show, we police the state of truth in the Republic. And because truth is communicated to us by journalists and analysts, we have made it our civic duty at the Fort Hall School of Government to put it to the test. We advance from two confirmed truths about the media. One, and according to Roger Stone, the media is either lazy or evil. And for the most part, it is both evil and lazy. That is why the truth, their truth, must be put to a test. Two, another confirmed truth is that journalism is verified gossip. In fact, what is presented to us as news analysis is gossip that has been verified by journalists. This gossip has to be ground truthed. For the next 2 years, we will monitor columnists. We will assess the state of truth in what they submit to the Republic, and we will pass verdict on what is true and what is not. For the record, we are not journalists. We are thinkers. We are not lazy or evil. We are thinkers. And we do not verify gossip. What we give you is the truth that sets you free. On today's show, we will discuss our favorite columns of last week. Columns which reflect unformed and uninformed opinions, and columns that made you stupid. Columns that made you stupid are columns which fell into the cognitive trap of we see things as we are, not as they are. Columns based on conjecture history, and columns that smack of envelope journalism. Welcome to the show, CS and GK.
Thank you.
Asante sana. This week, I review an article by Mr. David Kigoshi titled Rotational Presidency Won't Cure Exclusion, which appeared in the Standard Daily on Friday, 15th January. Mr. Kigoshi essentially takes issue with the Mululu Declaration when the President of our Republic pronounced himself on the 40 versus 2 narrative, and he addressed the reality of ethnicity in our national politics. Mr. Kigoshi pointed out that the hint by President Uhuru Kenyatta that he might champion calls for Kikuyus and Kalenjins not to field presidential candidates in 2022, since their members have ruled the country since independence, raises fundamental issues that need serious interrogation. In his column, Mr. Kigoshi props up an impressive strawman argument by proposing that those who are in agreement with the president are basing their reasoning on models borrowed from Switzerland and Nigeria. He points out that Switzerland has a consensus model where their federal council is comprised of 7 members, each serving a 4-year term on the council. And the members are drawn from the major political parties, and that the members go on to pick one of the 7 to serve a 1-year term as president. He argues that their model is based on parties and not ethnicity. Having made that point, the article then jumps on a direct flight to Nigeria, where the argument is advanced by again telling us that Nigeria has a rotational presidency based on zoning, where the presidency alternates between the north and the south every 8 years, and when the president is from the north, the vice president is from the south, and vice versa. The article ties up its argument in a neat bow tie that suggests that rotating the presidency amongst the 43 tribes will mean that if the president goes for 2 5-year terms, the tribe last on the list will have to wait 420 years for the presidency. Unfortunately, the entire line of argument fronted by Mr. Kigoshi, the argument that globetrotted to Nigeria by way of Switzerland, collapses in its entirety because the premise is false to begin with. At no point in time has the president ever suggested that all of Kenya's ethnic groupings should stand in a line and take turns, one after the other, like in a game of tipo. What the president suggested, however, is in keeping with the philosophy that underlies the Building Bridges Initiative report, a philosophy of inclusion desired by the very electorate from which the president derives his mandate. In practice, the First Amendment to the Constitution of Kenya 2010 would achieve this in part by expanding the executive. This fosters a better opportunity to achieve the requirement and aspiration of Article 130, Sub-Article 2 of the Katiba, which stipulates the composition of the national executive shall reflect the regional and ethnic diversity of the people of Kenya. I think that we can all agree that having 5 principles, that is, a president, a deputy president, a prime minister, and 2 deputy prime ministers at the helm, instead of 2 principles, would result in a significantly higher probability that we will have a more representative government. Furthermore, let us also recall that what is further proposed is that cabinet ministers will be drawn from both inside and outside parliament, once again reinforcing the aspiration of having representative government and achieving the aim of having a national executive that is, to borrow from the wording in Genesis, made in the image of Kenya. Ultimately, what we all desire is a government for the people, of the people, and by the people. And allow me to say this. I was there at UHURU Park in the crowds in 2010 when the Constitution was promulgated. And I distinctly kumbuka the euphoria when the people of our republic witnessed their Constitution becoming a living document. It is imperative that that sense of ownership permeates every facet of our national architecture. Katiba ni ya wananchi, na ni muhimu pia serikali iwe ya wananchi watukufu wa Jamhuri ya Kenya. And that is what I understood the president to mean. The article is, however, right about 2 things. The rotational presidency, the one of Tipo, is not captured in the BBI. What is instead captured is an expanded executive that aims to achieve inclusion. Secondly, he's also right about one thing. The BBI report is a document that is meant to unify the country.
I totally agree.
Completely.
So therefore, any logic of rotation must be based on something logical, something
Factual.
that makes sense.
Yeah, what is being proposed is not a simplistic model.
Yeah.
It's a little more sophisticated than that.
Fantastic. So this week, I review an article by Peter Kirui, and it is titled, "We Could Ditch Democracy, Go Consociational." It's in the Daily Nation. It was there last week. His main thesis is that while the Constitution envisages a democracy whose main principle is freedom of choice, and whoever garners the most votes is the winner, unfortunately, Kenyans vote mostly along ethnic lines, bringing a feeling of disenfranchisement and exclusion among ethnic minorities. He goes on to tell us that the initial BBI report had proposed a consociational system, and it was suggested as a cure to the hotly contested elections, but was dropped in the latest version and the subsequent amendment bill. He argues that in the latest version of this BBI, this essential item has been dropped. And this will be an important point to remember, because perhaps it points to some sort of mischief. He points out that if the chief issue is to have some sort of rotational presidency between the tribes, then he rightly points out that the elephant in the room is which model of government should we adopt. I particularly liked this article mostly because Kirui goes on to offer us a solution, and he even introduces a concept to us Kenyans. One I think that the Fifth Estate had given us before, but it's called consociational democracy. Now, consociationalism is a form of power sharing in a democracy, and the goals of consociationalism are governmental stability, the survival of the power sharing arrangements, the survival of democracy, and the avoidance of violence. These are the very things that Uhuru Kenyatta is seeking to cure. He tells us that consociationalism is a system that constitutionalizes ethnic communities, religions, or other identity groups in a government structure. It advocates group representation, and power sharing. It is normally proposed for a deeply divided society, especially where race, religion, or ethnicity is so distinct that it is not possible to build consensus or political alliances across these identities. Crucially, Kirui points out the advantages of such a model. One, the strength of this system is that it reduces political contestation among factions holding the state together. Though in some sort of federation, it still works. And it also protects the identity of nations within this state. The baffling thing, though, is at the end of his article, he says that this model wouldn't work for Kenya. And he says so because Kenya has many ethnic communities. He flatly tells us it could have worked if Kenya had less than 5 ethnic communities. In my opinion, it is here that he misses the point. The idea behind consociational democracy is in fact to build a broad super coalition that then represents the majority of interests, not that every tribe must eventually occupy the top seat. If he had dug a little deeper, he would have gone back to the work of Arend Liphart, who developed this concept of consociationism. In his first major work, The Politics of Accommodation, Pluralism, and Democracy in the Netherlands, he demonstrates how a complex system of political representation can offer safeguards for different social segments of the pillars of a Dutch society. Arend sees consensus democracy as appropriate for any society with a consensual political culture, which is what we have. Consensus democracies have multi-party systems, parliamentarism with oversized and therefore inclusive cabinet coalitions. It has proportional electoral systems. It has rigid constitutions protected by judicial review and independent central banks. And these institutions ensure, firstly, that only a broad supermajority can control policy, and secondly, that once a coalition takes power, its ability to infringe on the minority rights is limited. This is important. And so the proposal to move past a winner-take-all system to one at the very least that accommodates a best-loser system is something to be considered for Kenya. For far too long, there has been too much focus on presidential elections and their implications for political stability. And now we have an opportunity to pay attention to Parliament, to create a strong and independent legislature that can be a force for good. Lastly, I believe that in 2022, Bunge, aka Parliament, should be the main game in town. And if the negotiations are happening now, then all political actors should ask themselves, is the solution being offered by BBI going to make me better off? And the idea behind a good negotiation outcome is that the outcome of it should make you better off than you would have been had you not negotiated. So the House of Gemma, the Mulemba Nation, the Kamba Nation, you all need to liberate yourselves from the bondage of history. And BBI is showing you the safest route out. So this is a caution. A big mistake in any negotiation is to focus only on what you want in the short term. And for the rest of us, perhaps this new culture will allow us to seek new communities of interest.
I like it. Have there been groups in Kenya who felt that they have been excluded from power?
Yeah.
I think so.
Exactly.
And has this led to a zero-sum, winner-take-all push for the presidency? I think so.
Yep.
So I think that consociational democracy is the way to have elections that do not end in crisis of legitimacy and war.
Exactly.
I think the article proposes a very good model, but when thinking about the convenience of the numbers that would go into such a system, forgets our history by saying it wouldn't work in Kenya. But look into our history, it shows us that it is best suited for our democracy.
Yeah.
In keeping with the BBI theme, I would like to take a look at a column by a gentleman called Edward Mwachinga. His column is titled BBI Proposals Boost Kenya's War on Violent Extremism, and it was published in The Star last week on Friday, 15th January 2021. He begins by rightly pointing out that the BBI report and the attendant constitutional amendment bill have been the subject of much debate, especially the proposals that relate to the system of government. Yet, there are other proposals which, while they may not receive as much attention, have the potential to impact our lives significantly. One such proposal relates to addressing insecurity and, in particular, radicalization and violent extremism. And Mr. Machinga says that in the BBI report, insecurity is one of the biggest challenges that Kenyans effectively addressed. Kenyans told the BBI task force that they did not feel sufficiently safe and secure, a perception that has undermined the quest for a united and prosperous nation. He continues to say that aggressive external forces, including violent extremist groups, were identified among the major threats to national security and the safety of ordinary Kenyans. This is perhaps informed by the recurrent terrorist attacks on Kenyan soil in recent years. And I have to say that it is not forgotten that this country has been attacked for quite some time. And it's true that while at the moment we may be battling the coronavirus, in the past we have been at war with violent extremism. We cannot forget the 2013 Westgate attack, the 2014 Mpeketoni attack, and the attack on the Dusit D2 complex in January 2019. Those were dark days indeed. And in Mr. Machinga's article, he goes on to say that the BBI underscores the principle that citizen safety and security is the main primary aim of national security. In doing so, it advocates for a revamped counter-terrorism policy that encompasses measures to detect and counter radicalization and violent extremism across the state and public institutions. He says that the BPI proposes a one government approach to fighting and defeating terrorists and their sympathizers by roping in all government ministries, departments, and agencies. He says that a collective approach will help entrench a culture of vigilance and responsiveness to factors and conditions that drive extremism and other forms of violent behavior at both national and county levels. According to Mr. Machinga, this approach to preventing countering violent extremism, PCVE, is aligned with international goals on combating radicalization and terrorism. And I agree. Effective prevention of violent extremism requires cooperation and coordination between multiple government actors. This includes the police, the National Security Committees, the Ministries of Interior, Labor, and Education, among others. This is called the whole of government approach, and it was adopted by the US after 9/11. Or, as he calls it, the one government approach. But successful prevention of violent extremism, it requires dialogue and cooperation between government actors and non-government actors, such as religious leaders, the youth, women, community leaders, and the private sector. This is known as the whole of society approach. According to Mr. Machinga, the BBI proposes a whole of society approach. It proposes a raft of policy, legal, and institutional reforms to our preventing PCVE architecture, the preventing and combating violent extremism architecture, that include incorporating youth programs that cover education and health. All these, in the end, will secure our country. Increasing educational opportunities will prevent the youth from turning to violent groups by addressing their immediate social and economic grievances. More importantly, it will ensure that our young people are equipped with employment and entrepreneurial skills. So in discussing BBI, let us not get so caught up on the political details that we end up throwing the baby out with the proverbial bathwater. Let us take a collective step back and see BBI for what it is, the First Amendment to the Constitution of Kenya. There will be many others.
I like that. So we should change it to the First Amendment and not BBI.
Yes, it's a much nicer term, don't you think?
Yes.
Borrows from James Madison.
Yeah.
And I think it makes a very important point because there's this notion that BBI is about creating positions when there's so much more. And those people who are saying it's about creating positions should maybe try and read the report.
There you go.
Let's go back to the Mululu Declaration,
Yes.
as you called it.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us on Media Police Post. Columnists, remember, this is going to be a weekly show, and we want to put you on notice. We are watching you.
Fantastic.